Book 4, Sanctus Januarius. Quote, "With a flaming spear you crushed all its ice until my soul, roaring toward the ocean rushed, of its highest hope and goal. Ever healthier it swells, lovingly compelled but free, thus it lauds your miracles, fairest month of January." End quote. That poem is the beginning dedication for Book 4 of the Gay Science, written by Nietzsche in Genoa, January of 1882. And as Nietzsche says in Ecce Homo, this entire book is a gift from the saint. And by the saint, he means Saint Januarius. And in Walter Kaufmann's footnote on the meaning of the name, Sanctus Januarius, as the name of Book 4 of the Gay Science, there's a church in Naples that is dedicated to Saint Januarius, where his blood is kept in a vial, and there's a miracle every year where it becomes liquid again at his feast day. And so Kaufmann's interpretation is that, put crudely, and I'm quoting Kaufmann here, Nietzsche calls Book 4 Sanctus Januarius because he feels that his own blood has become liquid again, end quote. And I love that so much because it's, Nietzsche's such an irreverent and anti-Christian philosopher, and yet he's freely indulging in these Christian metaphors for discussing sort of his state of mind. As Klosowski says, Nietzsche is expressing a certain tonality of his soul. That's what's speaking through him here, and the metaphor of dried blood becoming liquid again, a kind of miracle, a kind of something supernatural that is making Nietzsche's life flow through him once again. Remember, Nietzsche's entire worldview or metaphysics of flux that he derives or is influenced by Heraclitus against these sort of eternal facts, the static metaphysics of Plato, Kant, and so on. For Nietzsche, to be alive is to be moving, flowing, changing, developing, and these ideas of forms or a sort of static, eternal, noumenal truth are like so much dried blood to him, is perhaps the best way to put it. And so this poem that Nietzsche offers, there's that line, lovingly compelled but free. And this is a key phrase, I think, in the poem, because Nietzsche is transitioning here from a more positivist bent, the middle period of his thought, as it's often called, that begins with Human All Too Human, sometimes also referred to as the Free Spirit trilogy, where Nietzsche is more influenced, again, by the French aphorists, by Voltaire, La Rochefoucauld, these types. And he is transitioning here to really, Book 4 of the Gay Science is where we first get the articulations of his affirmative philosophy that will be most famously put forward in Zarathustra. And of course, Book 4 of the Gay Science ends with the aphorism entitled Incipit Tragedia. It's the opening scene from Zarathustra's prologue, which would of course be his next book. So this book flows directly into Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a sort of, specifically, Book 4 of the Gay Science is a sort of preamble to the project in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's the first articulations of the eternal return, for example, and the Amor fati, and many of these ideas that will be given this full poetic, lyrical expression in Zarathustra. And so one way to put this, or to think about this, might be that when Nietzsche begins his philosophical project in earnest with Human All Too Human, that book begins with a critique of metaphysics. It's where he turns against Schopenhauer and Wagner. The next book, Daybreak, involves a critique on morality. It's where Nietzsche says he launches his campaign against morality. And he's trying to come to a purely naturalistic view of human life and the human being, and a naturalistic view of the world, which is a project we might say is shared by, as I mentioned, the positivists, which is why it's often said that Nietzsche has this sort of positivist phase. But maybe one way to get at this is like a concrete example. Nietzsche makes the point very early on in Human All Too Human to go against Schopenhauer's idea of intelligible freedom in order to promote a more avowedly deterministic view of human life, one that at times reads as almost a mechanistic view of human life. And so he repudiates the idea of free will. But here, again, to go back to the line in this poem that begins Book 4, lovingly compelled but free. So we have, as Michael Sugrue called it, one of those Nietzschean oxymorons, a paradoxical thought of being compelled and yet free, finding freedom within fatalism. And I think this encapsulates the turn that's going on in Nietzsche's thought. He's still trying to think purely within terms of the world as nature, we might say. This is also 1882, is around the time when Nietzsche speaks of his affinity with Spinoza. And Spinoza also has a deterministic view of nature. He also has a, we might say, morally relative view of good and evil. Nothing is ultimately good or ultimately evil from the perspective of the divine. But Spinoza also has this idea of Amor, the intellectual love of God. And Nietzsche in his later years would write of Goethe, that something like Spinoza's Amor could be experienced again. That's sort of the beauty of Goethe, who's a Spinozist to some extent, although he puts Spinoza into his own language, into a much more poetical language. But in any case, the intellectual love of God is, it's this attitude toward the world against the backdrop of Spinozistic determinism, in which one recognizes that nothing is ultimately good or evil, good or bad from the ultimate perspective, the absolute perspective. It's only your hopes and your fears, the sad passions, that really sort of make you, we might say, ill-disposed towards the world. But if one can become free of the sad passions, then they could become well-disposed toward the world, regardless of whatever happens, out of the very recognition, in fact, that everything is fated, so to speak. It's all in the hands of God, we might say. There is a freedom to that, of having what Nietzsche called a trusting fatalism, which he, you might contrast that with what he would later call Russian fatalism, which is sort of like resignationism. He says the Russian soldiers just sort of lay down in the snow and die when they know the battle is hopeless or something like that, which I don't think is true, but the point he's trying to make is that there's a kind of fatalism that ultimately is just an expression of world weariness, and there's another kind in which one throws themselves into the world, into activity, as, say, Goethe did, who sees that they are compelled by fate, by forces, by nature, whatever it may be, by God himself, in the case of Spinoza. But this isn't used as some sort of pretext to cease all activity and say it's all hopeless, what's the point? Quite the opposite. I can throw myself wholeheartedly into my life because I trust in fate. And so in this line, lovingly compelled but free, what is it that's lovingly compelled but free? Well, he says, with a flaming spear you crushed all its ice until my soul, roaring toward the ocean, rushed of its highest hope and goal. So it's the ocean of its highest hope and goal. And that's, again, the sort of the Columbus metaphors that lace the gay science. Columbus obviously departs from Genoa, or he's a Genovese, and Nietzsche is living in Genoa at this time. And there are so many metaphors about sailing out across the ocean to a new world, a whole nother continent that Columbus discovered, a whole nother world that the old world was not even aware of. There's a philosophical metaphor there. So the sea is Nietzsche's highest hope, the ocean, this open field of possibilities that's dangerous, that's full of, but who knows what could be on the other side of it if we make this perilous, dangerous journey. And the idea, also the metaphor of a flaming spear, sort of, we can imagine like hitting a frozen sort of figure, a frozen soul, and shattering all of the ice there. And who does this? The fairest month of January, right? So again, it's just Nietzsche expressing a high tonality of his soul, as Klosowski would say. By this time, Nietzsche has begun to convalesce significantly from a really bad period of his illness, and he's started to sort of find his ideal air pressure, humidity, altitude, all of these things we've discussed before that he talks about in Ecce Homo, of trying to find the correct place, the correct climate in which he could dwell that would be conducive to his health. But for whatever reason, it's in this month of January 1882 where Nietzsche feels like he has a second wind. And he feels like he can really finally begin his grand project, begin writing his affirmative philosophy, because at this point, the idea of the eternal return has struck him, as he says in Ecce Homo, 6,000 feet beyond man and time. And it's changed his whole orientation toward the world. And so this book is the most direct expression of that. This is the book 4 of the Gay Science, where the eternal return first appears in its fully articulated form. And you could say that's sort of the main thought, the guiding thought in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And so let's begin. Let's get into the aphorisms of this book. And it begins with one of my favorite that we have actually read multiple times on the show before, but we'll begin with 276, quote, "For the new year, I still live, I still think, I still have to live, for I still have to think. Sum ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum." Today, everybody permits himself the expression of his wish and his dearest thought. Hence, I too shall say what it is that I wish from myself today, and what was the first thought to run across my heart this year. What thought shall be for me the reason, warranty, and sweetness of my life henceforth. I want to learn more and more, to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful. Amor fati, let that be my love henceforth. I do not wish to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse those who accuse. Looking away shall be my only negation. And all in all, and on the whole, someday I wish to be only a yes-sayer. End quote. And so we'll go through many of the things in this passage. I mean, much of it is very straightforward here, of just an expression of Nietzsche's mission statement. But it's very interesting what that is. He says, I want to see more and more as beautiful what is necessary in things. So there we have it again, that Nietzsche's project up to this point philosophically has been, yes, it's been anti-metaphysical, anti-moral. It has been attempting to take us down to earth, trying to ground our understanding of the world in the phenomenal, in the empirical, and yet he says, I want to see that as beautiful. So what Nietzsche means by what is necessary in things, we might say, for example, one thing that's necessary is the past, both world history and our own past. In that, you cannot change the past. It's set in stone. What happened, happened. And as Nietzsche will later articulate, that because he invokes Amor fati here, the love of fate, what he'll later articulate is that wanting one thing to be different means wanting the entire world to be different. So within the entire tapestry of a human life, if you pull at one of those threads, you change the entire life, the entire person. You might think, what if I could go back and change just one or two things about my life? But it would fundamentally alter who you are as a person. And there's a wonderful Star Trek episode about this, by the way, from Star Trek The Next Generation, where Q, who's sort of this cosmic divine entity, shows Jean-Luc Picard, who has some regrets about his past. What if he could go and pull at one of the or two of the threads of that tapestry of his life and undo some of his past regrets? And he finds that he would completely unmake himself as a person. He would be completely changing who he is, that his mistakes and many of the things that he regrets were actually incredibly valuable because without them, he is not who he is. And it's a wonderful episode. It's called Tapestry, but I couldn't help but think of that here in trying to explain this. But beyond the necessity of the past, or beyond the necessity of all of the elements of one's life making up who they are, we might even just say the hard truths that Nietzsche believes he has discovered. For example, about the utter amorality or even immorality of the world and of nature, of the fact that our entire faculty of knowledge is a fallible thing, an extraordinary thing, could even be regarded, consciousness itself could even be regarded as an error in the total economy of physical life, physiological life. It seems that life itself can do without consciousness, and consciousness is a very fortuitous and yet at the same time fragile thing and prone to all these pathologies. And the human animal, as Nietzsche will later come to conclude, is primarily now driven by ressentiment and the bad conscience and all of these things. These are all necessary facts. And so this is the scientific element of Nietzsche's project here, in that so much of philosophy since the time of Plato, with its metaphysical idealism and its morality, has either been an attempt to judge and condemn the world as it is now, and that we need to fix it, or to, in some way, falsify the world, make it other than what it is. There's always this element of things ought to be different. How can we make things other than what they are? Or perhaps things are actually other than what they appear to be. Whereas Nietzsche's project is to see as beautiful what is necessary. So to see things as they are, and then to affirm that reality, affirm necessity, affirm the is, rather than lunging for, reaching for the ought, or the metaphysical or moral justification for the world. The world justifies itself. How? Aesthetically. And so Nietzsche is still looking to beauty. He's still looking to aesthetics as a justification for life here. That dictum that he expressed back in Birth of Tragedy, which I think he does ultimately move on from in some ways by the end of his career, but I think there's an element of that in his thought that's a thread that lasts really throughout his entire philosophical career. And another interesting aspect of this passage is that he first reverses Descartes, and then he gives the traditional Descartes quote. So, I am, therefore I think, and I think, therefore I am. And it is particularly interesting to read this in the wake of having just studied Klosowski, because, there's so much in Klosowski's work about lucidity and thought in Nietzsche's work, and sort of his mind and his body almost being at war, or him becoming an observer of the war between what he calls the somatic and the spiritual. So spirit, Geist, intellect, versus the somatic, the bodily, that which is unconscious or automatic. And he did often write around this time of thinking as a kind of great burden, something that caused him to suffer. And one of the upsides of his bouts of illness was that Nietzsche lived an almost ascetic life during the periods when he was trying to convalesce, where he almost couldn't think at all, where his migraines were just too severe, where he lived in Spartan conditions and everything was just focused on getting well again. And that was almost like a reprieve from these thoughts that, at least as Klosowski puts it, are like almost dissolving his mind, his sense of self. I mean, his work constitutes in many ways an attack on consciousness, or a critique of the idea that consciousness is this sovereign operating faculty in favor of the unconsciousness, the body, as the active force, or the locus of active forces, something like that. And yet here he says, I still live, I still think, I still have to live, for I still have to think. So there's this idea of, if all of that's true, if Nietzsche's project, and we know, regardless of how Klosowski puts it, it was a struggle for Nietzsche to read and write because of his illness, because of his condition. He was, and he did feel as though his migraines would shut down his ability to think entirely. And so, however we understand that, it does feel as though these opening lines of this aphorism, I still have to live, for I still have to think, are Nietzsche talking about thought, again, as something that is not, it's funny because later in this book he'll talk about thought as an experimentation and inquiry, as a kind of pleasure and as a kind of joy. But here it does seem more like a duty or a burden, or perhaps another necessity. And I think there is an element of that here, that Nietzsche, in this total passage, as a sort of New Year's promise, that everyone today sort of, what is the first thought that runs across your mind in the new year? What is it that you're going to dedicate yourself to? What is your New Year's resolution? And for Nietzsche, it is that Amor fati. I don't want to accuse. I don't want to be one of those ought-sayers, one of those people who is condemning and judging the world. And I don't even want to accuse the accusers, the people who are doing this. I'm not even negating them. I even accept that they exist, that this moral mode of evaluating the world and evaluating life, which normally ends up saying no to life, that too is necessary. And my migraines that halt my thought, and the fact that when that goes away and I convalesce, I have these thoughts that seem to be dissolving my own consciousness. That too is a necessary part of who I am, and what my role in life shall be, and what my fate is. And so I want to see all of that necessity as beautiful. I'm going to find what is beautiful about what is necessary. My only negation of what is ugly, of the negative aesthetic valuations I make about things in the world, will be to simply look away from them. As he writes later, where one cannot love, one should pass by. And therefore, that's my only negation. I want to be wholly a yes-sayer. I want to simply affirm and say yes to this world. And so that's the move from looking at a world that is mechanistic, positivistic, a world in which one is compelled. How does one become compelled and yet free? By finding what is beautiful and affirming the necessity, affirming what it is that one is compelled to do, the fate that one is compelled to hold. And that beauty, that invocation of that aesthetic value judgment, that is the paradox of Nietzsche's gay science, of his frolicking wisdom. That science is supposed to be cool, dispassionate. It is fundamentally, for Nietzsche, grounded in what is. And yet, you can never establish an aesthetic valuation based on a scientific experiment or a logical series of postulates. It has to simply be a decision, a mindset, again, or a certain tonality of the soul, a certain Anschauung, a certain view of the world, a certain predisposition. Perhaps it flows out of your instincts. Certain people will be well predisposed to the world. And Nietzsche is declaring that that is his New Year's resolution. And so a very cheerful commencement to Book 4 of the Gay Science. So let's move on to 277. Quote, personal providence. There is a certain high point in life. Once we have reached that, we are, for all our freedom, once more in the greatest danger of spiritual unfreedom. And no matter how much we have faced up to the beautiful chaos of existence and denied it all providential reason and goodness, we still have to pass our hardest test. For it is only now that the idea of a personal providence confronts us with the most penetrating force, and the best advocate, the evidence of our eyes, speaks for it. Now that we can see how palpably always everything that happens to us turns out for the best. Every day and every hour life seems to have no other wish than to prove this proposition again and again. Whatever it is, bad weather or good, the loss of a friend, sickness, slander, the failure of some letter to arrive, the spraining of an ankle, a glance into a shop, a counter-argument, the opening of a book, a dream, a fraud, either immediately or very soon after it proves to be something that must not be missing. It has a profound significance and use precisely for us. Is there any more dangerous seduction that might tempt one to renounce one's faith in the gods of Epicurus, who have no care and are unknown, and to believe instead in some petty deity who is full of care and personally knows every little hair on our head and finds nothing nauseous in the most miserable small service? Well, I think that in spite of all this, we should leave the gods in peace, as well as the genii who are ready to serve us, and rest content with the supposition that our own practical and theoretical skill in interpreting and arranging events has now reached its high point. Nor should we conceive too high an opinion of this dexterity of our wisdom when at times we are excessively surprised by the wonderful harmony created by the playing of our instrument, a harmony that sounds too good for us to dare to give credit to ourselves. Indeed, now and then someone plays with us. Good old chance. Now and then chance guides our hand, and the wisest providence could not think up a more beautiful music than that which our foolish hand produces then. End quote. So what is Nietzsche referring to here? Well, let's just break down what specifically he says. So we renounce this idea of providence in the sense of everything is in God's hands, that there's some sort of consciousness or intelligence guiding all of the events of the universe, and instead begin to see all of the workings of the phenomenal world as guided by a kind of purposeless necessity. And Nietzsche correlates this with a certain high point in life because it corresponds to the sort of the revelation that he's had, the new lease on life that he's just established in 276. That idea, this correlates with a high sense of freedom, that sense of affirming everything within existence, affirming all that is necessary, finding what is beautiful in it. But for all of that freedom, you're in the greatest danger of spiritual unfreedom. And what is that? Well, no longer seeing a sort of general providence, but a personal providence. Not a God governing everything, but perhaps a deity governing your own life. That someone is looking out for you in this royal of apparent chance and chaos. And I don't think we should take this too literally. I think we could call to mind a certain type of person who says, for example, everything happens for a reason. And so, all of these examples that he gives, bad weather or good, the loss of a friend, sickness, the opening of a book, a counter-argument, a dream, all of these seemingly random events that we come to understand must not be missing, as he says, in order for us to be as we are. In other words, we see their necessity, and when we affirm ourselves and affirm that necessity and try to see what's beautiful in it, precisely the new lease on life that Nietzsche's talking about, finding that freedom in being compelled, that's precisely where we're at, this danger of saying all of that happened for a reason, as though there was some sort of intentionality behind it. And he invokes Epicurus, who he says that his gods have no care and are unknown. And that was, sort of the famous agnosticism of the Epicureans that behave as though the gods exist, but, they don't actually... You really get the sense that Epicurus doesn't actually believe in the gods. He doesn't think it's something that can be known by mortal minds. It's something that you should pay your respects to the gods in order that, because if you behave piously, you'll have less cause to fear or worry about the afterlife, those sorts of considerations. And Nietzsche also invokes the Bible as sort of the counter to the Epicurean conception of the divine, because in the Gospels it said that God knows every little hair on your head, knows every last thing about you, and has a deeply invested personal care in you. And so it's very easy to make that leap from that affirmation of the necessary, Amor fati, because what you're saying is you're calling it, I'm going to put this very bluntly or very crudely, you're saying the way I am now I affirm, therefore I'm calling it good, and therefore all of the things that led up to me the way I am now, the tapestry of my life, even the things that are bad or I might regret or that seemed like they were bad at the time, actually led to an outcome that was good. And therefore it's very easy to leap from that to the everything happens for a reason, or perhaps in the case of like a New Age mindset, literally there's some God looking out for me. See, that's why I don't think we should think about it terribly literally, because I don't think that's all too common. I think Nietzsche is talking about an idea of a sort of like a hidden unconscious genius within oneself that is actually actively constructing your fate, that there was some sort of reason or intentionality or providence behind all of those random events. When in fact, what Nietzsche says at the end is that chance plays with us. Good old chance now and then guides our hand. And the wisest providence couldn't think this up. That it's not some personal genius. It's not some personal deity or providence. It's that, what does he say? Our foolish hand can produce this beautiful music. That it is truly by chance, by happenstance. And so that may seem to be an apparent contradiction, right? We're going to acknowledge what is necessary in all things, a purposeless necessity, but then here we have to invoke chance. And so, you could see that again as a sort of paradox of like, is it necessity, is it fated to happen, or is there true randomness or chaos within the system? And I think the key that we have to understand is intentionality. The real contradiction is not between chance and necessity or flux, chaos versus fate or what is set in stone. The real contradiction is between the introduction of a purpose or a reason or an intention versus recognizing the purposelessness, the intentionlessness, the pure unconsciousness of, frankly, life itself, and indeed our individual lives. And there's that great quote by Napoleon that I've brought up probably too many times, but it's just such a wonderful quote that I'm an instrument of providence, and when she is through with me, she will break me like a glass. Napoleon is certainly not a religious man, a believer in providence in the biblical sense, from all appearances, based on, his character, the things he did, and, the fact that he saw fit to crown himself and to, defy all of these morals and norms of old Europe. And yet he still seems to believe he has some sort of special destiny himself, that there's some sort of important story of which he is the main character. And thus, with a retrospective eye, this is really what Nietzsche's talking about, that in affirming ourselves as we are and saying that I affirm the goodness of my life as it is, and I accept all of that, I embrace it, it's very easy to reason from that retrospectively, after the fact, to look at everything that led up to it and believe that there was a reason that the bad thing happened because it will lead to something good. But there's actually no because. It just is that it did, that it was necessary, that it led to something good, even though there was no God in the machine. There was no personal genius or deity that was guiding that process. There was no destiny woven into the universe that was producing that outcome, that made you some sort of special thing which has a purpose and a reason for being. And that may seem very sort of pessimistic or cynical or something like that. But what Nietzsche is saying is, again, our practical and theoretical skill in interpreting and arranging events has now reached a high point. This is precisely why it's the greatest danger, because in that affirmation, you can end up sabotaging those practical and theoretical skills in reasoning by giving yourself over, getting carried away with that sort of lease on life. So it's kind of a typical Nietzschean turn, right? In that in the first aphorism, he gives us this very sort of beautiful explication of this new way of being in the world. And yet, in the very next aphorism, he gives us a potential danger of that new way of being in the world. So let's move on to 278. Quote, "The thought of death, living in the midst of this jumble of little lanes, needs, and voices, gives me a melancholy happiness. How much enjoyment, impatience, and desire, how much thirsty life and drunkenness of life comes to light every moment. And yet silence will soon descend on all these noisy, living, life-thirsty people. How his shadow stands even now behind everyone as his dark fellow traveler. It is always like the last moment before the departure of an immigrant's ship. People have more to say to each other than ever. The hour is late, and the ocean and its desolate silence are waiting impatiently behind all of this noise, so covetous and certain of their prey. And all and every one of them suppose that heretofore was little or nothing, while the near future is everything. And that is the reason for all of this haste, this clamor, this outshouting and overreaching each other. Everyone wants to be the first in this future, and yet death and deathly silence alone are certain and common to all in this future. How strange it is that this sole certainty and common element makes almost no impression on people, and that nothing is further from their minds than the feeling that they form a brotherhood of death. It makes me happy that men do not want at all to think the thought of death. I should like very much to do something that would make the thought of life even 100 times more appealing to them." End quote. And I love this passage as well. It's very interesting to compare it to, say, Pascal or Heidegger. Pascal imagines all of us as being like chained prisoners who see our brothers butchered before our eyes every single day, knowing that we are awaiting the chopping block someday in the future. What a terrible existential existence for us. Heidegger defines a key part of Dasein, of being here in the world, is being toward death. As Heidegger says, we pitch ourselves into the future. We live in the future. Our existence is it's conceived of, it's experienced as this existence which is constantly being drawn into the future. And yet, as Nietzsche says, right, that we all these people around him, he's sort of just speaking about everyday average people that he sees around him. This jumble of little lanes. We might imagine the city of Genoa, that a jumble of little lanes very much describes it. And then he says all of these needs and voices. So all of these people with their desires, with their values, their needs, their necessities, and all of their voices, we can imagine them calling to each other, shouting, conversing in the street. And Nietzsche can hear in their voices all this enjoyment and impatience and desire and thirst for life. And yet what was heretofore, what is in the past, what they have already lived, seems like little or nothing, whereas the future is everything. And yet at the end of that future, the only certainty, the only common thing to all of them in that future is death, the termination of all consciousness, all experience, the termination of being. And so it's interesting to think how somebody like Heidegger or Pascal would have taken this passage, because what Nietzsche is saying is the farthest thing from their minds is the fact that they all form a brotherhood of death, which is how Pascal would have described the human condition. And what Pascal is sort of trying to do in his Pensées is really bring to the forefront of our minds, we are in a brotherhood of death. That is what awaits you in the future. You should be holding this sort of existential horror and dread in the forefront of your mind at all times. Why? Because Pascal wants you to reject this world, seek the holy life, reject reason, which cannot ultimately solve the problem of mortality. And meanwhile, so that would be a way that Nietzsche differs from Pascal, because he says, it makes me happy that people do not want to think the thought of death. And so he's looking around at the masses, right? There are other passages where Nietzsche, including in this very book, where Nietzsche is very negative towards the masses. This is somewhat positive. He's saying, man, look at all these ordinary people with their everyday concerns, the haste in which they live, their haste to get into the future. And yet they don't even think about the fact that they're hastening themselves toward their own doom. And that's something beautiful. That's something positive about them, right? And so Pascal would say, no, they need to be thinking the thought of death. They need to be, that's going to motivate them to make like a moral or spiritual change. Whereas I think Heidegger would have quite the inverse of this objection, where he might say, no, the thought of death is not far from their minds. Maybe there are ways that they find of distracting themselves, but that's the active force, as our being towards death, and all of these distractions that people come up with are driven by that very thing, the fact that there is this being toward death that is the human condition. And we might think of Kierkegaard as well, with his idea of the aesthetic life and crop rotation, moving from one distraction to the next in order to constantly turn our eye away from the deep existential questions. And so what I love about this passage is that it's such an uncommon attitude among philosophers. Arguably, it's even uncommon to find this kind of consideration in Nietzsche's writing, that, the ordinary people are impoverished because they don't think about the deep questions we do. And Nietzsche's actually saying, how much thirstier for life can they become by not thinking about these deep questions, by not indulging a metaphysical need, by not, driving themselves mad, pondering the end, the mortality, the terminus of existence. How much richer can life be? It reminds me, again, to invoke Kierkegaard, where he says everyone has come along and made things more simple. That's what everyone has tried to do, solve problems, make things simpler. I would like to make things more difficult. I'd like to make things more complicated. Nietzsche is almost sort of saying, in a way, not the opposite, but a very opposite kind of sentiment. But, we might think of Cicero, to philosophize is to learn to die, a sentiment that Montaigne would say. And Nietzsche says, I'd like to do something that would make the thought of life 100 times more appealing. So the philosopher usually comes around and says, I want to make people think more about their death, for lack of a better word. You could say, I think it is a good argument that is where a lot of philosophizing comes from and is driven by. I mean, somebody like Freud might say that there's this sort of this need to confront our mortality that drives all of these other compensatory actions. And, Nietzsche would say, I want to make the thought of life more appealing for them. I want my work to do the opposite of drawing them closer to thinking the thought of death. I want them to think the thought of life. And, one might naturally respond, well, aren't the ordinary people already doing that? Why do we have a necessity for a philosophy of life if you look around and people are already throwing themselves into life with all haste, throwing themselves into the future without the thought of death? For what reason do we need Nietzsche? And, again, this is not a philosophical project of wanting to change what is or impose an ought upon the world. It's another celebration of something beautiful in what is necessary, that Nietzsche's looking around and saying, actually, one of these aspects of the ordinary consciousness, the ordinary Dasein, is an ignorance of the thought of death. And I affirm that and call it beautiful. That's actually a necessary thing. Yeah, that's how most people are. That's what life does. It seduces us into the appearance and makes us forget as we throw ourselves into the future that the only certainty in that future is your own doom. Who would want to live? Who would have that thirst for life, a thirst for the future, if that was the main thought on their minds? So it's good that life seduces us to continue living, to not think the thought of death. Let's go to 279. Quote, "Star friendship. We were friends and have become estranged, but this was right, and we do not want to conceal and obscure it from ourselves, as if we had reason to feel ashamed. We are two ships, each of which has its goal and course. Our paths may cross, and we may celebrate a feast together, as we did. And then the good ships rested so quietly in one harbor and one sunshine that it may have looked as if they had reached their goal, and as if they had one goal. But then the almighty force of our tasks drove us apart again, into different seas and sunny zones, and perhaps we shall never see each other again. Perhaps we shall meet again, but fail to recognize each other. Our exposure to different seas and suns has changed us. That we have to become estranged is the law above us. By the same token, we should also become more venerable for each other, and the memory of our former friendship more sacred. There is probably a tremendous but invisible stellar orbit in which our very different ways and goals may be included as small parts of this path. Let us rise up to this thought. But our life is too short and our power of vision too small for us to be more than friends in the sense of this sublime possibility. Let us then believe in our star friendship, even if we should be compelled to be earth enemies." End quote. So the first remark I would make here would be that we're again capitulating to this theme of necessity and affirming necessity insofar as there's a law above us. So the way that ships navigate according to the stars. So, imagining the self as your own little ship, your own little vessel going through life. And we're navigating according to the same stars. And those stars by which we set our course, because we have our own tasks, perhaps we are brought together by happenstance, by chance, for a time. And it may even seem, as we sail together on the same course, that was the goal, that we should be together, that we should become friends, unified in our vision. And yet, we still drift apart. We may never see each other once again. And so that's why Nietzsche says there's the possibility of a tremendous but invisible stellar orbit that brings us together, our very different ways and goals. It's all part of this one, again, necessity. But so we can be friends in that sense, and that the stars bring us together, and yet we're aimed at, it turns out that was just a chance necessity that our ships sailed together for a time, because in fact, in terms of our task on this earth, we are quote-unquote enemies. And one of the things that Kaufman says is that oftentimes this has been people believe that Nietzsche's talking about Wagner here, which he might very well have that thought in his head. But he cites a letter that Nietzsche wrote to Franz Overbeck. Nietzsche and Overbeck were friends throughout their whole lives, even though, obviously being a theologian, Overbeck had a very different understanding of his task in life, and just a very different view of the world and his place in it than Nietzsche had. And they naturally had to drift apart, so to speak. But the reason why Kaufman thinks it's about Overbeck is, so he cites this letter where there are very similar metaphors used, and I'll just read the excerpt that he includes in the footnote. Quote, "My dear friend, what is this, our life? A boat that swims in the sea, and all one knows for certain about it is that one day it will capsize. Here we are, two good old boats that have been faithful neighbors, and above all your hand has done its best to keep me from capsizing. Let us then continue our voyage, each for the other's sake, for a long time yet, a long time. We should miss each other so much. Tolerably calm seas and good winds, and above all sun. What I wish for myself, I wish for you too, and am sorry that my gratitude can find expression only in such a wish, and has no influence at all on wind and weather." End quote. So, a very similar metaphor about the two of us being two boats sailing together, two good old boats that have been faithful neighbors, and yet they're on such fundamentally different voyages. So there's not that much more to say here except that it's, once again, this is an affirmation, a celebration of the beauty of chance, that the law above us, this purposeless necessity, the stars by which we all set our course, brought our two ships together. That we have this friendship sort of written in the stars, even if we might be enemies, earthly enemies, with our tasks. And so with that, let's go to 280, quote, "Architecture for the search for knowledge. One day, and probably soon, we need some recognition of what above all is lacking in our big cities. Quiet and wide, expansive places for reflection. Places with long, high-ceilinged cloisters for bad or all too sunny weather, where no shouting or noise of carriages can reach, and where good manners would prohibit even priests from praying aloud. Buildings and sites that would altogether give expression to the sublimity of thoughtfulness and of stepping aside. The time is past when the church possessed a monopoly on reflection, when the vita completiva always had to be the first of all a vita religiosa, and everything built by the church gives expression to that idea. I do not see how we could remain content with such buildings, even if they were stripped of their churchly purposes. The language spoken by these buildings is far too rhetorical and unfree, reminding us that they are houses of God and ostentatious monuments of some supramundane intercourse. We who are godless could not think our thoughts in such surroundings. We wish to see ourselves translated into stone and plants. We want to take walks in ourselves when we stroll around these buildings and gardens." End quote. So Nietzsche weighing in on some city planning concerns. What's lacking in our big cities are quiet and wide, expansive places for reflection. And he means indoor. We need architecture for the search for knowledge is the name of this section, and not churches. You probably already got that sort of impression at the beginning of the aphorism that we need places where good manners would prohibit even priests from praying aloud, because the high cloistered ceilings and all this sounds like a church or a cathedral, and he's saying no, but not that kind of place. A place of true contemplation. And the church, he's saying the architecture of the church gives expression to religion as primary and contemplation only as a subset or as a part of the religious life, as a thing leading to the religious life or something taking place within the religious life. And it's interesting, contemplation, where that word comes from, contemplo. So it's something you do in the temple. The word contemplation comes from a religious context, etymologically. And the irony, Alan Watts talked about this, that churches have become talking shops, and that seems to be one of Nietzsche's problems with them here, is that, it's a place where you go to be sermonized, to have a sermon read to you, and, where you go and you pray and you talk, you give your confession or something like that. And yeah, there are people who go in to just contemplate, but I think really what he's giving us the impression of with the architecture is that there's something that is supposed to draw you to see that there's a power above and beyond yourself sort of standing in judgment of you. And this is something I can't really give like an objective logical argument for, of why the architecture of a church gives this feeling. But as Nietzsche says, even if you stripped all of the churchly purposes from them, you take down the Jesus on the crucifix and take away the confessional booths and all of these things, and still the architecture would still impose this upon you. You would still feel as though you've entered a place where there is something which judges and condemns you, that you are the wretched sinner, and that you are here, that there's something, perhaps we might say, even though Nietzsche does not say this explicitly, perhaps implies it with the vita religiosa, the religious life. There's something about penitence, about self-abnegation, about lowering of yourself, about prostrating yourself, that is actually fundamentally opposed to contemplation. That the religious origins of contemplation, of thinking in the temple, are actually a misnomer, because it is precisely those feelings of I'm a wretch, I'm not worthy, I just need to submit myself to God. That's precisely opposed to thinking, all of those things. Because the role of the subordinate is not to think. The role of he who is wretched, who is not worthy of being a sovereign, who is not morally fit to be the sovereign of his life. What good are his contemplations? Well, they're only valuable insofar as they're contemplations on his own wretchedness, on the meaning of his existence as a slave of the divine or something like that. And so, when Nietzsche says we wish to see ourselves translated into stone and plants, he doesn't mean in the sense of, where Zarathustra talks about not bidding you to become ghosts and plants. He doesn't mean transformed or in that way. Or sorry, he actually says translated. Right? He means translated into stone in the form of architecture, in the form of gardens and these things, these buildings and gardens. We want to take walks in ourselves. So the architecture should actually reflect the human, not reflect this notion of a divine standing in judgment of humanity. And that, again, even if you were to take all the explicitly religious aesthetics away, the architecture would still speak that language. We need a new space just for contemplation that is not stained by the vita religiosa. And do we have that today? I would argue really no. No, we don't. I don't think we've ever successfully created the new style of architecture that Nietzsche yearned for here. And it is interesting that here, earlier he was sort of celebrating living in this jumble of little lanes and voices, and here he's saying, but the contemplative person, the philosophical person, the intellectual person, the spirited person, they also need a place to retreat from all of that. And we don't have such a place, because the place of spiritual, intellectual retreat and inwardness is stained by this condemnation of mankind, of you're a sinful wretch. And the contemplation that goes on there is always in that subordinate position, which is not a thinker, a self-legislator, because that's really what thought is. That really the value of thought is its ability to legislate values, as Nietzsche will later come to understand. Well, you can't legislate values as a subordinate wretch. You can't actually carry out the function of thought, so long as that is your orientation toward the world. Let's go to 281. Quote, knowing how to end, masters of the first rank are revealed by the fact that in great as well as small matters they know how to end perfectly, whether it is a matter of ending a melody or a thought, or the fifth act of a tragedy or of an action of state. The best of the second rank always become restless as the end approaches, and do not manage to slope into the sea in such proud and calm harmony as, for example, the mountains at Portofino, where the Bay of Genoa ends its melody. End quote. So once again, the Genoa influence comes through. We've spoken about this quite a bit, but using the mountains of Portofino as a perfect landscape scene, again crafted by purposeless necessity from Nietzsche's point of view, that ends perfectly as the mountains slope into the sea perfectly, and very few. Even the best masters of anything, whether it be music, whether it be statecraft, whether it be literature, whatever it might be, even the masters who are not absolutely of the first rank, the peerless masters, the greatest, do not, where they fall short, is in knowing how to end. And I think that is such a wonderful insight, because I've often... I don't know if anyone else has put forward this idea, but the beginning of a story and the way that we experience the beginning of, say, a series, consider a series of films or books or even a television series, anything which is serialized, you could have an incredible first episode. Let's consider a show like, let's get into vulgar pop culture discussions. So Lost. That show was ABC, I believe. That show was, it seized the American zeitgeist. When that show came out, it just dominated public attention. It was the hottest new thing. So many people were just hooked on that show. And, they had a great pilot, and they had a great first season. They established the world, the lore, the mysteries, the character, the setting so well. What's the thing that everyone knows about Lost? It's that the ending is really disappointing. And the fact of the matter is, once you know that, once you've seen the ending, it actually makes the beginning worse. It actually deprives it of value. If you consider just the first episode from the pure craft of creating television, creating cinema, if we want to call it that, because, in a lot of ways, that distinction doesn't really mean anything anymore. It's all just film, right? Just purely from the angle of like the craft involved, story craft, and also just the technical craft, yeah, it's still as great as it ever was, but because it's inevitably linked to the ending, right? It's not a self-contained story. It's a story that proceeds into other artistic products. And if the ending isn't good, it actually makes the beginning deprived of whatever value that it had. Because who would ever tell anyone to embark on watching Lost these days, having seen the whole thing? We know that it's a mystery without a satisfying ending. It's just a mystery box, as J.J. Abrams says, that he thinks it's more interesting to pose questions than answer them. And that's why I don't even think he's a master of the second rank, but certainly he's a master at pulling on the heartstrings. Certainly he's a Wagnerian sort of magician who can draw emotions out of people with individual scenes and set pieces. And he can do all of that sort of thing, but he doesn't know how to bring it home. He doesn't know how to end it. He doesn't know how to cut the Gordian knot, because that's really not what his focus is. And he is correct that it's the mystery that draws people in. And once you have them hooked, and if you're just thinking about art as a product that you're selling, if it's just part of the culture industry, it doesn't really matter if you come to a satisfying artistic ending, right? And that's why I think he's basically a snake oil salesman in artistic form. But Nietzsche is correct here that, among all of the greatest masters in any art or craft, it's completion. It's the ending. It's, as they say in gymnastics, sticking the landing. That's really the important thing. That's what separates the wheat from the chaff. That's what separates, say, a Goethe, whose ending of his two-part play, Faust, you might think, if you were a contemporaneous reader of Faust who read the initial publication, you might think, how could he possibly bring this around to a satisfying ending that's at the same time surprising and subverts my expectations and is still satisfying? And yet Goethe somehow manages to do that. That's why it's one of the greatest works of all time. And how many stand in the same league with Goethe? Very few people. Shakespeare and Milton and all of the usual suspects, as we might say. Usual Suspects. There's a movie with a satisfying completion to it, right? Where the ending, the good ending of The Usual Suspects, actually enhances and actually does justice to, but it improves the beginning, right? You see the beginning with new eyes because the ending is so good. And so that's the insight I'm trying to get at here. The ending actually changes the beginning. The ending of an artistic project, it actually makes the beginning better or worse, which is a very strange idea, because you might just say, well, it just stands on its own merit. But whenever you link a project like that, which is by the way, why Goethe advised poets to just write occasional poems, write what comes to you day by day. He advises Eckermann not to embark on a great work, even though he himself is writing a great work. But he basically says, the example he gives is, let's say you want to do a poetic cycle where you talk about all the seasons, and you have a ballad for spring, and then one for summer, and one for fall, and one for winter. And let's say you write a great poem about spring, but then your poem on summer is subpar. The critics say it's lacking. It's not as well received by the audience. That will then be linked forever to your poem on spring. Whereas if you just let each of these poems stand as their own work, not part of some cycle, but just their own poem, their destiny wouldn't be linked to other parts of some opus, as it were, that could actually have the effect of dragging them down. That, you should really only embark on a great work if you're willing to bring it all to completion, because by linking it all together like that, if you fail at the end, the whole thing fails. And so I think Nietzsche is correct here. Let's go on to 282. Quote, "Gate, by certain manners of the spirit, even great spirits betray that they come from the mob or semi-mob, It is above all the gait and stride of their thoughts that betrays them. They cannot walk. Thus Napoleon, too, was unable, to his profound chagrin, to walk like a prince, quote, legitimately, on occasions when that is really required, such as great coronation processions. Even then he was always only the leader of a column, proud and hasty at the same time, and very conscious of this. There is something laughable about the sight of authors who enjoy the rustling folds of long and involved sentences. They are trying to cover up their feet, end quote. And, it's funny because Nietzsche's normally very positive about Napoleon, but here he brings up something I think is very obvious if you've read anything about Napoleon, that, he's a soldier. He's not really nobility. He makes himself nobility. He seizes a place in the aristocracy among the aristocrats of history, but he is at bottom a soldier with all the uncouthness and sort of all the implications of that come along with it. As Nietzsche says, both hasty and proud. And there's something about being a head of state, being like one of those monarchs of the old dynasties, the kind that actually thought their rule was sanctioned by gods or by Christian God, by the holy God. That, when you believe that, and when you come from like a dynasty and think that you have some sort of divine right to rule, it introduces a sort of priestly element to the monarchy in which you sort of can stand for something, you become a symbol of something or an archetype of something that transcends you, and that allows you to bring some sort of dignity to the role that perhaps can't be captured by a person, an ordinary person, something like that. I mean, we might think of like the coronation ceremonies for the British royalty and how the thoughts that must pass before your head of how you're just one in a link. You're a link in a chain of all these ancestors who've stood in the same place. The same archbishop has sort of crowned you, and the same. It's like you're participating in this chain of nobility that goes back a long way, of which you're simply a participant, and that there might be something about that grounds you in some way, or allows you to have a level of dignity or solemnity that just can't be captured by an uncouth soldier. But, something we should pay attention to here is that the name of the passage, and he says, even great spirits betray, they come from the mob or semi-mob. It's the gait and stride of their thoughts that betray them. And then the example he uses at the end, he talks about rustling folds of long and involved sentences. So he's talking about the stride, the pace of thought as it comes out, for example, in the way someone writes. And when we see the pace and way that they think, the sort of the bearing of their thought, the gait, the way their thought walks, it's a very interesting metaphor. They betray themselves to us of who they really are. We could set aside the question of aristocratic or base-born origins that, of course, concern Nietzsche here, but we might say that there is something about the kinds, it's like something we might not ordinarily think about. The way that the kinds of sentence structure and diction and the pacing that an author sets down reveals something to us about not just like artistic intentions or something like that, but his personality. And so much, it's very easy to understand this when we just think about Nietzsche's writing and how much of his personality comes through in his writing. And, also the way he talks about pace again, about the pace of thought and the pace of writing in Beyond Good and Evil, in Book 2 of Beyond Good and Evil. And what he says there in that book is that it's difficult to be understood if you're one whose thought moves at a hare's pace when you're in a nation of men whose thought moves at a snail's pace, or even at sort of implying that the pace that he thinks at is at like the pace at which the Ganges flows, this rapid flowing river. That's how Nietzsche's thought proceeds, and the Germans are these, stubborn, blockheaded buffoons going at a tortoise pace, something like that. Just like their thought is slow. Thoughts come slowly to them, and they stubbornly cling on to them. They're not willing to move and flow with their thoughts as Nietzsche is. And he sort of talks about what's remarkable about Machiavelli is that he's able to give us these very realistic, amoral considerations about history and politics while letting us breathe the dry air of Florence as he walks us through his thoughts at a brisk allegrissimo. And so it those comments on pacing there, I think, are very helpful for what Nietzsche is getting at with studying someone's gait, the way that they walk, which he uses. Napoleon is really a metaphor for that, for the gait of our thought. That's why he brings up Napoleon betraying himself as mob or semi-mob, and the way he comports himself in his bearing at, say, the coronation. We have a bearing, we have a comportment, we have a pace, we have a gait in our writing, therefore in our thought. That betrays something of our true nature or our origins. Okay, let's go to 283. Quote, "Preparatory human beings, I welcome all signs that a more virile, warlike age is about to begin, which will restore honor to courage above all. For this age shall prepare the way for one yet higher, and it shall gather the strength that this higher age will require some day, the age that will carry heroism into the search for knowledge, and that will wage wars for the sake of ideas and their consequences. To this end, we now need many preparatory, courageous human beings who cannot very well leap out of nothing any more than out of the sand and slime of present-day civilization and metropolitanism. Human beings who know how to be silent, lonely, resolute, and content, and constant in invisible activities. Human beings who are bent on seeking in all things for what in them must be overcome. Human beings distinguished as much by cheerfulness, patience, unpretentiousness, and contempt for all great vanities, as by magnanimity in victory and forbearance regarding the small vanities of the vanquished. Human beings whose judgment concerning all victors and the share of chance in every victory and fame is sharp and free. Human beings with their own festivals, their own working days, and their own periods of mourning, accustomed to command with assurance, but instantly ready to obey when that is called for. Equally proud, equally serving their own cause in both cases. More endangered human beings, more fruitful human beings, happier beings. For believe me, the secret for harvesting from existence the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment is to live dangerously. Build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius. Send your ships into uncharted seas. Live at war with your peers and yourselves. Be robbers and conquerors, as long as you cannot be rulers and possessors, you seekers of knowledge. Soon the age will be past when you could be content to live hidden in forests like shy deer. At long last the search for knowledge will reach out for its due. It will want to rule and possess, and you with it." End quote. So what a passage, right? One of the most famous passages in Nietzsche, or at least the quote, "To live dangerously, build your temples in the slopes of Mount Vesuvius." But let's consider the name of the passage, preparatory human beings. And what does that mean? We're preparing for a new age. And it's a new age of knowledge. It's an age that will carry heroism into the search for knowledge and wage wars for the sake of ideas and their consequences. So, when Nietzsche says at the beginning that he welcomes that a more virile, warlike age is about to begin, there's two ways you could take this. As, the vitalist right might interpret this more literally. He's literally talking about a more warlike age. People are going to become more manly, these barbarians. We're going to return to barbarism and all of these things in the coming age. But you could also interpret it, maybe say more like a Walter Kaufman style interpretation, that no, he's purely talking about knowledge. And, maybe you might see this as a cop-out, but I think it's clearly both. I think Nietzsche is saying here that he thinks this new literally warlike age will bring heroism into the search for knowledge, which is interesting because it's not the way we normally think about it. We normally think when, the barbarians are at the gates, when the Mongols are conquering, the dynasty that ruled China at the time, or when the Odovacar is overthrowing the late Roman Empire, that it's like the destruction of the search for knowledge, that it's the end of an age of words and letters and a return to just a militaristic age. So what Nietzsche is hoping for here does seem sort of like a contradiction, but it's perhaps a hope for a future in which that warlike nature inherent in mankind that always seems to return, that always seems to come back, what if that were to fuel, what if we were to take on that same attitude and bring that into the search for knowledge, bring heroism into the search for knowledge? And remember that much of what Nietzsche says about the will to truth is that to actually follow the will to truth, what you don't need is, you don't need a surplus of reason. What you need is courage above all things. What you need is heroism. That's why he admired Schopenhauer. You need to be able to entertain notions that completely fly in the face of the conventional moral considerations, or even your own conscience, even your own sensibilities. You have to be able to recognize when you don't want something to be true, and maybe you don't want something to be true with good reason, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not, nevertheless, true. There might be horrific consequences departing with the truth of certain doctrines that are widely accepted or held, and yet that says nothing as to whether or not that's actually the truth of them. And Nietzsche would say oftentimes when we ignore that truth, it's not because we're just not smart enough to know it. It's that we have some block, we have some boundary line that we've established saying, I cannot be brave enough to accept that truth. Perhaps the strength of a soul could be measured by how much truth it could tolerate. So that being said, the famous line, live dangerously, it certainly applies to one's own life. It certainly applies to life paths and life decisions, that it's very important that all of this is embodied, that this is a total view of life. This is, again, a new lease on life, a new handle on life, a new worldview that Nietzsche's talking about, that we in the current age can prepare for by living dangerously, by building our temples on the slopes of Vesuvius. So where our place of value in the sacred and so on should be situated in precisely a precarious place, that we should wager everything on a crazy, bold idea, that we should be willing to risk our own ruin or personal tragedy for the sake of a great idea, to be willing to wage war in the name of ideas and their consequences, as he says. But that this living dangerously, this does specifically apply to the search for knowledge as well. That what interests him here as a philosopher is a philosophy, a way of doing philosophy, which is dangerous in that same way, which risks everything, which is willing to undermine the foundations of our society, which is willing to critique the pillars of Western civilization or something like that. And that we shouldn't simply be content with our valuations, with our morals, with our metaphysics as it's been received, even when there are voices that warn us away, the voices of the herd, that normally the philosopher is just a species of priest, a shepherd, that warns us away from these, that instead, as he ends the passage, the search for knowledge will reach up for its due. It will want to rule and possess, and you with it, right? But wait, is he saying we will also want to rule and possess? No, he's saying the search for knowledge will want to rule and possess. You will be one of the things that it rules and possesses. And that's very interesting as well, because he talks about commanding and obeying, knowing when to obey the search for knowledge. So with Nietzsche himself, his will to truth, which rules and possesses him, he knows how to obey that will to truth. And his desire is to take that warlike heroism into the search for truth. And so what Nietzsche says, that these preparatory human beings that we need, again, I think there is an element of the literal warlikeness, but the traits that he talks about, right? He says they just can't come out of the sand. They can't come out of our present-day civilization, which is metropolitan, and it's, the people who live in metropolises and these sort of the vast modern congregations of many, many human beings. We need people who can be silent and lonely and resolute and content and constant in invisible activities. So it's interesting, his contrast with the metropolitan lifestyle is the singular, the solitary intellect, the solitary spirit. And then all of the traits that he lists, again, they do have to do with combat, but in the intellectual realm. You can sort of imagine a cheerful warrior, a cheerful knight of knowledge, one of those knight poets, right, of the Renaissance, the provincial knight poets. So, but they seek in all things what in them must be overcome. So, Nietzsche, we might say, looks at the ways in which mankind himself shall be overcome. He looks at the ways in which the will to truth shall be overcome. Is this him judging and condemning man or judging and condemning the will to truth? No, in fact, he would say all things overcome themselves in some way or another. And the way in which something overcomes itself is something contained within it already, so to speak. Again, there's a way in which there's no inside and no outside here because, again, chance is always at play. But the thing that overcomes the will to truth will actually be the will to truth itself. The thing that's going to overcome man will be man himself. And of course, Nietzsche will follow up on this with his Overman idea in his next book. But what are some other things? Human beings whose judgment concerning all victors and the share of chance in every victory and fame is sharp and free. The idea when Scipio fell at his feet and wept after they destroyed Carthage. Carthage had been Rome's geopolitical enemy across 3 wars. By the time leading up to the last Carthaginian War, in which Rome invades and completely destroys the Carthaginians, Cato the Elder, I believe it was ending every speech by saying, and by the way, I think that Carthage must be destroyed. So, he was perhaps particularly a war hawk, but people had yearned for the destruction of Carthage for a long time in Rome. And when they finally, the great general, Scipio Africanus? Yeah. When he finally is the one who inherits this glory of, I am the general who gets to destroy our ancient great enemy, he weeps because he realizes the same fate will befall Rome one day. That there's something of like a recognition of the person of like a free and broad-minded intellect that can see what I've just done to Carthage could just as easily be Rome. And that, in fact, it's the fate of all empires one day. And so that allows you to be magnanimous in victory somewhat. But again, this is very interesting. Nietzsche makes other comments that it would be, I think you should go through on your own of all the sort of statements he makes about these preparatory human beings, what they are prepared to do and what they are preparing our intellectual life to do. But just consider those not just literally, but in the realm of philosophy and in the intellectual domain. Being able to see, for example, the element of chance in every previous great philosopher's quote-unquote victory, the way in which who they were and what they were prepared them to discover precisely the thing that they did, to have the insights that they had that we may celebrate now, but they were precisely at the right time and place of a fated, fortuitous physiology fundamentally to have those insights, and therefore to be magnanimous in your victory over them. So perhaps you might say, if you're a Nietzschean, that Nietzsche is victorious over the likes of Hegel and Schopenhauer and Kant, these previous figures of German idealism, and yet we should be magnanimous in our victory because each one of them, Plato, Schopenhauer, Kant, Schopenhauer, and Hegel, not Plato, although Plato certainly had an influencing role there. Each one of them saw the things that they did. Nietzsche can be victorious over them because he is positioned by chance in a certain place. And Nietzsche would say, my own physiology, my bouts of health and yet my strong nervous system that allows me my bouts of sickness and my strong nervous system, that this great health that I possess that allows me to overcome my sickness periodically, gave me an insight into the ascent and descent, the ascending and descending instincts and tendencies within mankind. And so that gave me an insight into evaluations. It gave me an insight into physiology as the root of all of our valuations. And that's what gave me the insight that Schopenhauer's philosophy, for example, is a confession of who Schopenhauer is. And so I can be magnanimous in my victory over Schopenhauer, quote unquote. And so I think that ultimately is the thrust of this passage, that these free spirits, as Nietzsche has called them up to this point, I think are these preparatory human beings. What we need to prepare the ground for this new age of heroic knowledge are people who stand apart from the moral boundaries set on our thought by metropolis, the people of metropolitan modern-day civilization, and they will prepare the way by living dangerously, by pursuing the task of philosophy in a dangerous manner. Okay, 284. Quote, faith in oneself. Few people have faith in themselves. Of these few, some are endowed with it as with a useful blindness or a partial eclipse of their spirit. What would they behold if they could see to the bottom of themselves? While the rest have to acquire it. Everything good, fine, or great they do is first of all an argument against the skeptic inside them. They have to convince or persuade him, and that almost requires genius. These are the great self-dissatisfied people. End quote. Okay, so the few people who have faith in themselves, many among them have faith in themselves just because they don't know themselves very well. They have a partial eclipse of their spirit, or a useful blindness, he calls it. Then we probably know, you probably know some people like this, right? They might have faith in them. Like, we might think of somebody who is overconfident in their abilities because they're so full of themselves. They have a higher than perhaps they should opinion of their ability to succeed at anything. And then perhaps that confidence actually allows them to succeed even where they shouldn't. To have sort of like beginner's luck, I think, is often that kind of like naive overconfidence, right? That you might, this could just apply to so many different things. But the rest, Nietzsche says, have to acquire it, which these are the great self-dissatisfied people that he's talking about. So paradoxically, they acquire faith in themselves by being forever dissatisfied with themselves. And we might imagine that there are plenty of people who are dissatisfied with themselves all the time who are not great. But the great ones are the ones who use that. They use everything good, fine, or great that they do as an argument against the skeptic inside them. So many people they lack faith in themselves because of that nagging voice. Perhaps we might say in pathological terms an inferiority complex, but people often talk about imposter syndrome and things like this, where even very many famous and successful people are constantly have that voice inside of their head that are constantly telling them, you're not good enough. They actually, it's the opposite of the person who has that partial blindness or useful blindness that gives them that overconfidence that can occasionally be useful. It gives them a faith in themselves, versus the man who's well aware of all of his faults, who's well aware of all of the things that he knows are lacking in his abilities. And therefore, it requires a kind of genius, kind of greatness on his part to persuade that skeptical voice by bringing to mind all of the successes, all of the ways in which they ought to have faith in themselves. That's how they earn it, as part of an argument against that voice of conscience that's saying, well, you really know how inadequate you are, right? And so that's what it means to acquire it. You can be a self-dissatisfied person. The way you acquire faith in yourself is actually, it's more thoroughgoing, perhaps more solid, more stable, more justified, more earned when you acquire a faith in yourself. Versus, we might think of Siegfried, right, from Wagner's Ring Cycle, who is able to walk through the ring of fire precisely because only a man without fear can walk through the ring, and the reason why he doesn't have fear is because he's too stupid to know that fire would burn him, because he's like a naive, wild man, right? So he's fearless because he's stupid. That might be that's the fool as hero, which is a very common trope in Wagner's operas. What Nietzsche, he doesn't actually make a value judgment here. He just sort of brings up this other kind of person, which we might imagine, nevertheless, is probably closer to Nietzsche's kind of free spirit idea. The person who does have these depths. Nietzsche's saying, if you do have those depths, if you don't have that blindness towards yourself, that does reveal to you, that if that moral skepticism of Christianity has burrowed into you to where you can't have that one-dimensional view of others or yourself. You're aware of all of your sins, all the ways in which you miss the mark. The only way you're going to be able to acquire it is with a genius for shutting down the arguments of your inner skeptic. So it's very interesting. Let's go to 285, another one of, it's like we're in the very beginning of book 4 of the Case Science, and like every second or third passage, there's a classic, incredible example of Nietzschean prose, and that's certainly the case here with the next one, Excelsior. Quote, you will never pray again, never adore again, never again rest in endless trust. You do not permit yourself to stop before any ultimate wisdom, ultimate goodness, ultimate power. While unharnessing your thoughts, you have no perpetual guardian and friend for your seven solitudes. You live without a view of mountains with snow on their peaks and fire in their hearts. There is no avenger for you any more, nor any final improver. There is no longer any reason in what happens, no love in what will happen to you. No resting place is open any longer to your heart, where it only needs to find and no longer to seek. You resist any ultimate peace. You will the eternal recurrence of war and peace. Man of renunciation, all this you wish to renounce? Who will give you the strength for that? Nobody yet has had this strength. There is a lake that one day ceased to permit itself to flow off. It formed a dam where it had hitherto flown off, and ever since this lake is rising higher and higher. Perhaps this very renunciation will also lend us the strength needed to bear this renunciation. Perhaps man will rise ever higher as soon as he ceases to flow out into a God." End quote. So that language, the metaphor at the end, I've often used that when I'm trying to sort of encapsulate Nietzsche's whole project as regards, that all the value in human life flows off into the afterlife. I'm really getting that language from this passage. The image of a lake that dams itself and its waters just rise higher and higher rather than flowing off into a God, into this superordinate, transmundane other world. This noumenon, which stands behind all the appearances, which we never experience, which does not appear in any way. That we've made the destiny of mankind. We've made mankind into a function, our telos is to offer ourselves up in penitence to the divine, or something like that. And that what if our focus instead was on the elevation of man, so many, even though Nietzsche invokes the eternal recurrence of war and peace, this passage is really, I think, talking more about the overman idea, which is, it's not fully sketched out in the Gay Science, but especially over these next aphorisms, this one and 1, 2, or 3, 288 as well, are hinting at this new form of human life, this overcoming of man. And so the way Nietzsche talks about this, he says at the end, "Man of renunciation, all this you wish to renounce." So there's a way in which Nietzsche is himself a man of renunciation. I mean, we already talked about how he felt like a renunciate during his periods of convalescence, but he often speaks of, in these sacrilegious terms, of renunciation, normally sort of a virtue of the saint or the holy man. Instead, what we're renouncing is precisely the values of the saint or the holy man. That what Nietzsche sees in the religious life, in the metaphysical need, is a grasping for some sort of comfort. And that what we're renouncing, the reason why this requires bravery, is that we're renouncing that metaphysical comfort. And so what the things that he says we are renouncing. And by the way, I should say this first paragraph is all in quotations, so it's presumably another voice speaking, or a voice, sort of an inner voice speaking to Nietzsche saying, "You want to renounce all of these things? Well, no one's yet had the strength to renounce all of these things." And then the final paragraph about the lake rising ever higher and higher is sort of like Nietzsche's answer to this voice. But we'll go through the things. He says we're renouncing: praying, adoring, resting in endless trust. You don't permit yourself to stop before ultimate wisdom, ultimate goodness, ultimate power. You have no perpetual guardian or friend for your seven solitudes. And the seven solitudes, that's a very esoteric metaphor in Nietzsche. He doesn't explicitly explain it. And there was, I discussed this a little bit at the end of season 2, sort of interpretations of what the seven solitudes are. But he often talks about the seventh solitude, and he also, in one of his poems, invokes the idea of the solitude of a creator on his seventh day. And so I think what's really important here, the notion of the seventh solitude, the final solitude, is the solitude felt by a creator, someone who has brought a new worldview into being, who has legislated values, or really any creator after their great work. The solitude of rest, the infinite loneliness of having completed, enacted your great task, setting yourself apart from really the rest of humanity. And so you're alone in that manner, and also the emptiness that comes with the completion of the task, something like that. Having no friend, no peer after you've created something peerless, a peerless work of genius. You live without a view of the mountains, with snow on their peaks and fire in their hearts. So the idea of like the volcano of a great ancient force that's about to erupt. So Nietzsche says you live without a view of mountains with snow on their peaks and fire in their hearts. And I think what that means in this context is, again, the fact that no one else has had the strength, as he says. The fact that Nietzsche is just so often talking about the smallness of all the men around him. The fact that I think what he's saying here is like we don't actually have a view of the heights, the peaks that we can reach yet. We haven't actually seen a higher man that was not himself human, all too human. We have not actually seen the lake that rises ever higher and higher and higher. It's always flowed off into a god. We've never saved all that energy for a true eruption. He says there's no avenger for you anymore. There's no final improver. So no savior. We're renouncing the idea of a savior. We're not only renouncing the idea of praying and prostrating ourselves to a higher power as a form of metaphysical comfort, we're renouncing that narrative that all will be justified, all will be made well, all will be improved in the end. And what does he say? No resting place is open any longer in your heart. You're renouncing a resting place. So renouncing what would we say? I mean, this ties in, I think, with the idea of happiness found in movement, or fulfillment found in movement. The idea that it's in pursuing the goal that we find our reason for being, something like that. Never in reaching the goal. Reaching the goal is just, again, that sense of loneliness, that sense of emptiness. And so you always must move on to the next thing. And indeed, even with Nietzsche coming to his highest thought, the eternal recurrence, and then embodying that highest thought in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Does he stop writing? Is his task over? Well, no, he has to continue. He cannot rest in this in the completion of this task. And that may seem kind of contradictory, the things I've said of like, okay, you want to reach the seventh solitude in which you will have no friends, the solitude of the Creator after the seventh day, and yet there is no rest. There is no creation which ends with a day of rest. You want to renounce even that. And so nobody's had the strength for all of this yet. That's what Nietzsche says. That is the vision of a new way of human life, a new way of being, a new kind of man that overcomes man as he is now. No one has yet had the strength to renounce every metaphysical comfort, every moral comfort, every narrative and story about mankind that seems to settle everything. No one's yet had the strength for this. The strength not to yearn for an end. Because to yearn for the end, the Sabbath of Sabbaths, the day of rest, the eternal rest, is, in a sense, willing for death. Because death is stasis. It is eternality. It is infinity. Life is this finite, moving, dynamic thing. And who has yet had the strength to embrace that, not to reach beyond life? And if we were to do this, if we were not to let all of the value that we attribute to our lives flow off into a God, how much higher could man himself rise? There's not much more to say about this passage, but it's, once you know all of the direction of where Nietzsche's thought is going, especially in his next book, this passage, I think, makes a lot of sense, but it's worth just sort of disentangling all of these things. So let's go to 286. Quote, interruption. Here are hopes, but what will you hear and see of them if you have not experienced splendor, ardor, and dawns in your own souls? I can only remind you. More I cannot do. To move stones, to turn animals into men, is that what you want from me? Oh, if you are still stones and animals, then better look for your Orpheus. End quote. And so here, So it's an interruption, right? And is it an interruption in the flow and the themes of what Nietzsche's been talking about? Perhaps to some extent, in a way, but you could say it's that interrupting inner voice from another one of those competing, perhaps, lines of thought within Nietzsche that are all given expression here in this book. That what was just expressed are all of these hopes for mankind, of man rising ever higher and higher as an act of renunciation, renouncing the religious form of renunciation, right? Because the religious mode of life is the renunciation of the world, renouncing that metaphysical comfort that's gained by renouncing the world, and thus flowing back into the world with all of our focus, our value. But what Nietzsche says here, these hopes, right? Unless you're in your experience, you've experienced, he says here, splendor and ardor and dawns in your own souls. So unless you're the kind of person who can recognize this, for whom this kind of language will resonate, these kind of hopes will resonate, there's nothing I can do. I can only remind you, and we might think of, or we might remember Plato's dictum that learning is remembering. He can only remind you of what you must already know because your soul is already resonant with this kind of idea. You can't do any more than that. You can't move stones, turn animals into men. It's interesting because there's that passage, truth as Circe in Human All Too Human, that error has turned animals into men. Perhaps truth can turn them into animals again. What he's saying in that passage is that man is simply a clever animal. We have set ourselves above all of the animals. That was an error. That was a erroneous valuation of consciousness and the way that it makes us different as these free agents from the rest of the animal world. Perhaps truth can make us into animals again who will not overvalue our consciousness. Kind of a paradoxical thought, but truth as Circe is, of course, the sorceress who turns Odysseus's men into pigs, so turns man into animals. So truth will turn man back into an animal, will restore our the correct perception that we are simply another species of animals among animals. But here it's very much implied that the people who share kind of Nietzsche's hopes, these are the ones who have gone from animal into men. And so perhaps for another passage to think of here would be the essay Schopenhauer as Educator, when he says that the artist, saint, and philosopher, right, these types, these extraordinary types of people, nature makes her one leap in creating them. That all of the rest of humankind are closer to the other animals, but these three types are more similar to, or they're the closest thing to a truly human being that's ever lived so far. Now, even all of them, the artists, saints, and philosophers thus far, they have not had the strength for the renunciations that Nietzsche has spoken of here to truly fulfill his high hopes for mankind. They have not been adequate to effect this transformation, even if they perhaps prefigure it. So just the reason why I wanted to bring that up is because it shows that Nietzsche does have an interest in both showing the ways in which the ordinary human being, just by virtue of being a human being, is not actually that different from the rest of the animal kingdom. We're just another species, one that happens to be conscious, that happens to have this beautiful error of consciousness. But what if we did want to truly make something that was truly transcended the animal world? And later, of course, he'll adopt the language not of man, of something truly human, but of overman, something that overcomes man as he is now, which is simply one of the other animals. But Nietzsche can't turn animals into men, so through his philosophy, he's not going to effect this transformation. But perhaps some will read him who will be reminded that it will chime with the resonance of their own soul, that these hopes, that this is a hope that is worth having, that they might have seen that degree of splendor or experienced a dawn in their own soul that gives them that hope for the future of mankind. Let's go to 287, quote, "Delight in blindness. My thoughts, said the wanderer to his shadow, should show me where I stand, but they should not betray to me where I am going. I love my ignorance of the future and do not wish to perish of impatience and of tasting promised things ahead of time." End quote. So the wanderer and his shadow, these characters return again. This was a character that's introduced in the human all too human era and is invoked repeatedly throughout the middle period. And even to some extent, Zarathustra refers to himself as a wanderer. And one of the things about the wanderer and his shadow metaphor, which I think Nietzsche makes clear in the work which is named The Wanderer and His Shadow, the shadow here is not a Jungian shadow. He's using the shadow completely differently. Jung wasn't even, born yet when Nietzsche was writing, so it doesn't have any relation to that idea of the shadow. What Nietzsche is talking about is the shadow is consciousness. It's actually quite the opposite. The wanderer is the real person, and the shadow is this. It's a metaphor for consciousness because a shadow is cast by the light, right? The shadow itself is one-dimensional, right? It's a facsimile. It's a silhouette. It's a shape created, an image created by the light of knowledge, perhaps, or we might say self-awareness or sentience, creates this ego consciousness thing, which is really, that's not the person. Like, there's that one passage where Nietzsche says our consciousness stands in relation to the workings of the unconscious, the impulses, as the multiplication table stands to calculus or something like that. So like the actual workings, the activities going on in the unconsciousness, and our consciousness is just like it's like the charting, the representation of it, the putting that into some sort of language that we can understand. And it's a similar metaphor with the wanderer and his shadow, that the shadow cast by our consciousness. I mean, other times he talks about consciousness as a surface and skin or a sheen, right? So it's like just this glaze on top of this vast world beneath. And so that our consciousness stands to us as our shadow stands to our physical form, something like that. So the wanderer speaking to his shadow. And so this is why he's saying, my thoughts, this is what they should do. They should show me where I stand, but they should not betray where I'm going. So the body is giving the order to consciousness of what kind of thoughts it wants to think. Because, of course, the drives, the instincts, the true person, the true self that lives in the body and is your body, as Zarathustra will later say, that's the leading string of the mind's notions. And so this is, and in a way, Nietzsche is then the actual content of the passage talking about really just what kind of person he is. He wants his thoughts to show him where he stands. They should be, but not betray to him where he's going. I love my ignorance of the future. I'm sorry to use another Star Trek reference, but the pilot episode of Deep Space Nine, the captain's trying to explain to these aliens who experience all time all at once, like what the game of baseball is, which they can't understand. And one of them says, well, you value your ignorance of what is to come? And he basically says, well, yeah, or else the game wouldn't be fun. We have two people come in and compete, and they don't know what the outcome is going to be. And the fun is actually in seeing how the outcome unfolds. And if we knew the outcome ahead of time, it wouldn't be fun. That exploration, discovery, all of these things, we very much value them. And therefore, you need to be ignorant. You don't want to know all the answers ahead of time. And so that's really just what Nietzsche is expressing here. But it's interesting that he has the wanderer saying this to his shadow, because it's almost like Nietzsche's body, his very nature, is giving a directive to his thoughts, shaping the contour of his thoughts to be not concerned with where they will ultimately lead him. We might say again, like to reference an earlier passage, like where the road ultimately leads for all of us is death. And we could say, many people believe Nietzsche's thoughts ultimately lead to ruin, right? Many of the things he does want to hammer away at the foundations of Western civilization. He does want to destroy sacred cows that will have very terrible consequences. And he's almost saying, I love my ignorance of the future. I do not want to think based on the consequences of my thoughts. I don't want to start reasoning from a conclusion and rush to that conclusion. I want to start from where I am. I want to, again, look at what I see, what I perceive, what I see as necessary in the appearance, which is always in the now, in the immediacy, and let go of the consequences. Let go of those thoughts will ultimately conclude in calamity and ruin for our entire philosophical project. And if you focus on that and that's your orientation, then you would never philosophize at all. And, another passage to think from The Will to Power, from the notes there, where Nietzsche says, "We are conducting an experiment with truth. Perhaps mankind will perish because of it. Fine." One of the best passages in all of Nietzsche. And that's sort of like, he speaks so much about the experiment, thought as an experiment, philosophy as an experiment, Dionysus as a tempter god, the free spirits being baptized with the name tempters and attempters, those who experiment, those who seduce, those who are tempted. But anyway, the whole notion of experimentation. What's the fun of experimentation if you know where the experiment's already going to lead? Once you know where the experiment, what the conclusions of the experiment will be, once you've already run the experiment, once you've already turned those results into a scientific hypothesis and then a well-tested theory and proven theory, then the experiment, I guess you can run it again just to prove what you already know, but it's not the same thing as venturing into a new. What do all the people who are embarking in the sciences, who are the wunderkind in the sciences, what do they want to do? They want to go and experiment in the questions that haven't been answered. They want to discover things that haven't already been discovered. There's no, again, to invoke the example of Columbus, that is implied or suggested throughout the gay science. It's not really impressive for somebody today to sail from Genoa to, the Caribbean, because, the way that it was for Columbus, because nobody had ever done it before, right? It's not impressive to just do that again. In fact, technologically speaking, it's fairly easy to sail from Genoa to the Caribbean now, because it's been done so many times, and we've perfected the techniques of sailing to a degree that somebody from the 1500s couldn't even conceive of. So, yeah, I've probably spent a little too much time on this passage, but I think it's just interesting, the orientation towards life, again, that Nietzsche is putting forward here, and by making it the wanderer speaking to the shadow, that he's putting forward as a kind of nature within him to value his ignorance, to want to enjoy the discovery, the experimentation. And that ties in with the previous aphorism as well, in the way that Nietzsche says, "I can only remind you, I can't move you, I can't change you into other than what you are. These hopes are for people with whom those hopes will resonate. That's who I'm writing to." Similarly here, it's sort of like, this is just the nature of who I am. I am an experimenting soul. I'm one for whom, as Nietzsche will say later in this book, for whom life is a means to knowledge. And so that's just the nature of who I am. It's in my instincts that guide my thoughts along this path. And so in the previous aphorism, to then consider it from the lens of this one, he's writing for people who have similar instincts to himself. Let's go to 288, quote, "Elevated moods. It seems to me that most people simply do not believe in elevated moods, unless these last for moments only, or at most a quarter of an hour, except for those few who know at first hand the longer duration of elevated feelings. But to be a human being with one elevated feeling, to be a single great mood incarnate, that has hitherto been a mere dream and a delightful possibility, as yet history does not offer us any certain examples. Nevertheless, history might one day give birth to such people too, once a great many favorable preconditions have been created and determined that even the dice throws of the luckiest chance could not bring together today. What has so far entered our souls only now and then as an exception that made us shudder might perhaps be the usual state for these future souls, a perpetual movement between high and low, the feeling of high and low, a continual ascent as on stairs, and at the same time a sense of resting on clouds." End quote. So it's funny because even Nietzsche himself seems to waver as to whether it's better to be a simple type with one sort of defining mood, as he talks about it here, or we might say a defining sentiment, a defining worldview, a defining feeling, a one ruling thought, something like that, versus there are other times where he talks about multifarious types, people who have two conflicting poles or paradoxical nature to their soul, something like that. That can be a beautiful type of person who organizes the chaos or the contradictions within themselves, that these can be some of the greatest human beings, Goethe being one of them, for example. But here he certainly seems to say, imagine a type of human life in which one mood only rules, one long elevated mood. And of course, he says most people don't even really believe in elevated moods, because unless these last for moments only, or at most a quarter of an hour. So for most people, it's very hard, because he doesn't define exactly what an elevated mood is here, except at the end where he does so in very lyrical terms. But I certainly interpret this passage and imagine it as sort of the elevated mood could be compared to the Amor fati, or perhaps that highest thought that Nietzsche articulates at the beginning as part of his New Year's wish. That desire, suddenly being struck with the desire of, yes, I love all of existence. I bless all of existence. Let me see what's beautiful in all of existence. Let me not accuse any part of existence, only turn away from it, from what I find ugly in it. It seems that he begins writing this book from that high mood, that high tonality of the soul. And so here he's imagining, what if that state of mind were to last forever? And I think this is very good evidence that much of what Nietzsche is talking about in the overman concept, because I would say this is another vision of the overman, another prefiguration of the overman, this imagination of this higher kind of human life. Literally, one life is one single long elevated mood, a sort of a soul expression of an elevated mood. We almost can't even imagine that. We can't imagine a person who is not a multifarious patchwork, or a cosmopolitan soul, or a soul drawn between the master and the slave morality, or a soul that, partakes of all of these sort of stains in the consciousness of humankind. And this passage, I think, really speaks to the idea that the overman really signifies a transformation of consciousness. And perhaps not because consciousness itself is the goal, or the ultimate value, or the ends that the body is serving. I think Nietzsche's very much against that whole notion, or is very critical of that notion. But that, in a way, it's like the consciousness is the sign or the symptom that will reveal to us, one long single elevated mood, the great health of the kind of person who lived in that way. That above all, the overman will be freed from these shabby, human, all too human moods that we've discussed throughout this episode of self-abnegation and penitence. And so that would be like the bad conscience, or resentment and vindictiveness, all of these feelings that accuse life in some way or another. To be free of all accusation against life, against necessity, and to live solely in an elevated mood of affirmation. And Nietzsche says, even the luckiest dice throw of today could not bring forth such a human being, which is why we need preparatory human beings in order to pave the way for that to even be possible. And that's, I think, again, part of the overman idea, that way of living, that way of experiencing the world is so far from the way that we experience the world today that it's almost impossible to imagine. It does seem like a dream or a fantasy. And perhaps it is. Perhaps you might say that's Nietzsche's ought that he's imposing on the world. That's his condemnation of mankind as it exists now. And that's a fair critique, but the difference between Nietzsche and almost all of the other thinkers in this respect is that he does not see a moral improvement or a rational improvement or a spiritual improvement. It's an improvement to man himself on the level of a physiological transformation, on the level of literally becoming a different kind of being. And you could call it a biological transformation, you could call it all of these things, but a transformation, a real transformation of the psyche and the ordinary states and moods of that psyche. So feeling, the ordinary type of feeling this person has for life. So it's not a judgment about life that Nietzsche thinks we all need to adopt. It's not a practical improvement to the conditions of life, the reduction of suffering or the increase of pleasure. It's not to be found in another life. It's a transformation of the psyche and of the person, and a transformation of their mood, their feeling for life. And it usually isn't the standard by which philosophers judge human life, right? It's on the level of sentiment, emotion, feeling, passion, all of these things that Nietzsche is saying that we will transform. And so I think we'll call it there, actually, for this week. We've been going for almost 2 hours, and the next aphorism, Embark, I think will make for an excellent first aphorism rather than a final aphorism for this reading. And so I think, yeah, we're going to call it. But we've covered some of the richest and most just enjoyable and well-written, and again, I think treasures of Nietzschean prose we've already covered within the beginning of Book 4, and it just keeps getting better from here. Book 4 of The Gay Science is just one of the best things Nietzsche ever wrote. And so I'm so glad we finally gotten to this point in the reading. And yeah, very excited to continue with this. So thank you for joining me in our book club. Can't believe this has been like a year-long journey at this point. So it's going to take us more than a year once we finally finish the entirety of The Gay Science. But hey, that's just fine, all great things in time, right? All right, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.